Good morning, my name is Sara Lopes. I am from the University of Coimbra and I have been doing fieldwork to collect data about floral resources in Portugal. Today I will do an overview on that fieldwork, not only in Portugal but also in Belgium and the United Kingdom. This work is part of Work Package 3, whose main objective is to produce a spatial and temporal representation of floral resources at the European scale to help improve beekeeping. To achieve this goal, among other tasks, it is necessary to obtain phenology curves to validate flower resources models through Protocol 2 and evaluate floristic resources available in different landscapes over time through Protocol 3. The Protocol 2 consists in monitoring different plants of different bee-friendly species every 2 weeks in different sampling points. In each individual, flower buds, open flowers, wilted flowers and scars are counted and registered. These data reflect the percentage of flowering of the different species every 2 weeks and make it possible to obtain a phenology curve. With the phenology curve, we can identify the beginning of the flowering period, the peak when the maximum number of open flowers is reached, and the end of the flowering period. In Portugal, field surveys started in March 2020 and have continued this year to fill some gaps that occurred in 2020 regarding a restricted group of species. In Belgium, field surveys started in January 2021 and are expected until the end of November. And in the United Kingdom, field surveys started in the mid-February of this year and are also expected to end in November. In Portugal, a total of 40 species were monitored, 16 of them in 5 or more sampling points, 2 in 4 sampling points, and 22 in 3 or less sampling points. This year, the species being monitored are those for which there was not a minimum of 5 sampling points and those whose flowering period had already started before the first field survey. In Belgium, the species list currently being monitored is composed by 20 species. And in the UK, not all the plants are identified to the species level, but it's possible to count a total of 42 species and genus being monitored. Regarding more concrete results, for example for Jason montana, these are 7 phenological curves for 7 sampling points monitored for 20 field surveys. It is possible to observe that in most cases the flowering peak occurred at week 8, with the exception of the sampling points 3 and 4, where it occurred a week earlier. The duration of the flowering period also varied, being longer at the sampling point 1 and shorter in the sampling point 5. The general phenology curve for Jason montana is represented in black, and it's possible to see that the peak occurred at week 8, as in most places, and the flowering period lasted 24 weeks. So the work carried out so far has already made it possible to identify some difficulties and conclusions, most of which are common to the 3 countries, starting with the fact that deviations from year to year are not taken into account in this method. Also, in Portugal, starting in March 2020 mean that some of the species I wanted to observe were already flowering, but this problem is being surpassed throughout this year. Another difficulty is the limited accessibility to flowers in large shrubs and trees, not allowing to estimate the percentage of flowers with the same precision as in small plants with full access. Another event that interfered with the data collection in some sampling points was the land management as cutting of grass and, specifically in Portugal, preventive cleaning measures to avoid wildfires near populations. This means that we do not get an accurate natural growth phase. Also, in some sampling points, it is not possible to observe enough individuals for all the plant species. Moving on to Protocol 3, this is applied in different landscape windows of 10 per 10 kilometers, with the center defined by the position of the experimental hives, around which 2 areas with 1.5 and 3 kilometers radius are defined based on the foraging behavior range for honeybees. The landscape is divided in different polygons characterized according to the land cover types based on land use and plant communities, in which different sampling points should be visited from March to September every 20 to 30 days. At each sampling point, all species should be identified and classified as herbs, shrubs, and trees, and for each species the percentage of coverage and the number of open flowers must be calculated. The percentage coverage is estimated using quadrats depending on the plant habit, as you can observe in this image, and the number of flowers is counted using 1 meter per 1 meter square, and in the case of large shrubs and trees, it is counted in the smaller area and then converted into the real value for the estimated area of the plant. In Portugal, this protocol was applied in 2 landscape windows with very different landscapes, Serra da Lousa and Idenha Nova, and it's being applied this year in the landscape window made up mostly of vineyards in Pés da Régua, close to Douro River. This is the landscape where it was applied in Belgium last year from March to September, and in the United Kingdom where the fieldwork is taking place this year. When analyzing some data obtained in 2020 in Portugal and Belgium regarding the number of flowering plants each month taking into account their habit, as expected in Lausanne the majority of flowering plants are shrubs and in Idenha they are herbs. In the case of Belgium, most of the flowering species are herbs, with the exception of the months of May and September when there were more shrubs flowering. In Lausanne, it was in May that there was a greater number of flowering plants, while in Idenha and Belgium it was in April. Here I selected the closest polygon typologies to the experimental hives in Lausanne and Idenha, and regarding the number of flowers per square meter, it is possible to observe that the largest number of flowers registered in Lausanne was in May, and in April in Idenha Nova and Belgium. These peaks also correspond to the months when more plants were in flowering. In the case of Idenha and Lausanne, the polygons with the highest number of flowers per square meter are those in which the observation hives are located. Also, the period of time when floral resources are available is longer in Lausanne than in Idenha Nova, where an abrupt decline is observed since June. Other important parameters that must be calculated are nectar and pollen production. To quantify nectar production, the first step is the placement of transparent cloth bags to exclude pollinators for 24 hours. The next day, using capillaries, nectar is collected to estimate the volume, and finally the nectar is placed in the refractometer to obtain the sugar concentration. For pollen quantification, flower buds must be collected and kept in 70% ethanol. Flower buds are dissected, the anthers are counted and lightly crushed so that the pollen is released, and then the pollen can be counted using different methods. In Portugal, we are using the Neubauer chamber, or hemocitometer, that hold a standard volume of liquid under a cover slip and provide a grid for counting pollen grains. The number of pollen grains in a given sample can be extrapolated from the concentration in the hemocitometer to the total number in the original sample with a known volume. In all the 3 countries, both pollen and nectar quantifications are a work in progress, with the species being analyzed not only those monitored in Protocol 2, but also some of the species observed in the landscape windows in Protocol 3. So, again, some conclusions that we can draw from the work done so far, starting with the pandemic situation that led to the restriction of contacts, and therefore the fieldwork was reduced from 2 to 1 day of fieldwork per landscape window to avoid, for example, in Portugal staying overnight in Idenha Nova. Another problem common to Portugal and the United Kingdom are the typologies of polygons that are outdated or currently undergoing changes. But in Portugal, this problem is already solved and the polygons are updated. Another problem is the counting flowers in large numbers, and on large species is quite time consuming, and estimating areas visually always brings some associated error. Also, the inaccessibility to some sampling points in Portugal and the UK. In Portugal, due to the irregular terrain and limited access to private property, in which either we were unable to contact the owners or we were not authorized to access them. Also, regarding nectar quantifications, is a very time-consuming technique, as it involves the use of small microcapillaries that break and clog very easily. In addition, it is necessary to be careful when extracting nectar from the flower and placing it after in the refractometer to avoid losses. Finally, although this is a relatively simple protocol, it always requires basic knowledge of taxonomy and botany. So, to finish, summarizing all the information. Regarding Protocol 2, it is in progress in the 3 countries, being that in Portugal the species being observed at the moment are just some of those for which there wasn't a minimum of 5 sampling points. And regarding Protocol 3, the floral resources mapping is completed in Belgium, in 2 of the 3 landscape windows of Portugal, and it's being applied this year in the United Kingdom. In the 3 countries, the quantifications of nectar and pollen are still being carried out. And that's all. Thank you for your attention.